All right, welcome back. I'm here with a longtime friend, colleague, a man who I have great respect for, Jeff Higgins. Jeff, how you doing?
I'm doing well. Great to be here, Al.
Hey, there are few people on the planet Earth. I mean, you actually might be the pinnacle of knowledge in terms of how the ISO requirements and SEC standards that are coming forth are going to impact the need for us to adjust our human capital reporting. And so I look forward to what you have to share today, and we'll have a discussion. Obviously with me, but also with our participants. So I know you have a few slides to share, and then I'll come back in 10 minutes or so, and we'll have a chat. That sound good?
That sounds great. And thank you so much for the kind words, Al, which actually means I spent 18 or 19 years before this as Don Quixote, trying to champion something nobody thought would happen.
Enjoy.
All right. So without further ado, let's dive in. Just a moment or two about me. Jeff Higgins, founder and CEO of Human Capital Management Institute. It's a lot easier just to say HCMI. Have been involved in the analytics, workforce planning space for going on 20 years. As you heard, I've known Al for more than 10 of those, probably around 12, 13 years, but who's counting? And have also been involved in ISO metrics and reporting and standard setting effort for about 10 years. And the last few years, providing some support to institutional investors and other, filing briefs and what have you around standards for human capital reporting that ultimately culminated in an SEC announcement last August, which we're going to be talking about here and now. And so, there's some great articles out there and some great commentary. I'm going to mention a few of those. And then it's really, there's a need and an opportunity for every organization to better measure and report. And now, perhaps most importantly, disclose more information publicly. So with that, let's dive in. I used to survey the group to say how many of you have heard of, ISO Human Capital Reporting Standard, also known as ISO 30414. Typically, the response rate was about 15%, but I think we've surpassed that with the SEC's announcement last August, which, by the way, became official and effective in November of last year, meaning every public listed company or foreign based company that lists its shares on any U.S. exchange now needs to comply with new U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, requirements around disclosure. So they updated the disclosure rules for the first time in 35 years. Probably the single biggest, there were a number of changes, the single biggest featured change was the mandating of human capital as a new required disclosure. However, it's not that simple, as many things with the SEC never are. So we'll try to just touch on very quickly a few of the questions. How do we get here? Why? What does this mean? Is this required? What are my options? How can we comply? And really, I think probably Al and I will discuss the last few in terms of compliance and preparation and next steps, what you can and should be looking at and doing. Bottom line is, though, the world has changed. And for the first time ever, HR, human capital information, is now going to begin to be as important to disclosure and reporting, institutional investors, marketplace, as financial data has been for a long time, and legal data has been for a long time. So how did we get here? Well, I'm not going to reread all of this. I encourage you to read it on your own. I'm just going to kind of skip to, there's a much longer history, by the way, that goes way back that some of you may be aware of. But really, if we just pick it up in December of 2018, there was a new standard created by International Organization for Standards called ISO 30414. It is the start of what we would call GAAP, Generally Accepted Accounting Principles, but not for accounting, for HR. GAAP for HR, meaning how do you measure and report human capital? The start of that is that ISO 30414. And I've got a slide on that coming up to tell you a little bit more about it. That was globally passed in the end of 2018, so it's still, in terms of a standard, pretty new. And then in August of 2019, the SEC recommended changes. They had a comment period, and in August of 2020, they approved what's called Reg SK rules disclosure changes. The big featured item I already mentioned was human capital is now a required disclosure, subject to some decisions by each listing company. So probably the biggest news is it is required. Second biggest news is the SEC did not mandate specific metrics. So every company has to figure out what metrics they are going to report or disclose publicly. So I thought it might be appropriate to share a few comments just very quickly. Again, not going to read all of these. I encourage you to take a look at them. There's some great sources here. You can see that while it started slow, interestingly, and I don't mean to in any way denigrate any organizations at all, but some of the best reporting on the new SEC rules changes actually come from the finance and legal side. So you see CFO Magazine, PwC, now Deloitte, many others have all come up with guidelines and reports making this aware, and a lot of legal groups as well as institutional investor groups have all been talking about this. And this dovetails with a lot of the diversity, equity, and inclusion, the DE&I, the racial justice, injustice efforts and movements, and if anything, has been accelerated by COVID-19 and the pandemic. So long story short, the markets are on board, legal and accounting firms are on board. Still a bit of a question if HR is truly on board. I saw ATD had a great article from a friend of mine, Dave Vance, on the new SEC rules and referencing the ISO standard as well. But SHRM has been relatively quiet on this, which is probably not what we need from a leadership HR organization. Ideally, they will be coming out with some strong language fairly soon. Fortune 500 companies are already being approached by everybody and their uncle. So if you're involved in this in any way, you may already be getting approach or outreach as well. And hopefully this can give you some value. Okay, so if it's here, and you know a little bit about what can I do? What are my options? And we'll talk more about this. So you're now out of the plane. Hopefully you've got your parachute on. Either HR or someone else is going to be responsible for this. I would argue this is a sea change opportunity for HR to up their strategic game, to be in the room on the quarterly investor calls if they weren't already, and to speak directly to investors. I don't know, I'm happy to be corrected, but I don't know many CHROs today for public listed companies that are interacting and speaking directly to investors on a quarterly call, writing letters directly to investors. That is the opportunity, as well as having a significant amount of language and I guess paper that you can consume either in the annual report, the proxy statement, sustainability report, or even a separate human capital or people report, if you will. Some organizations are doing that. So what can you do? Well, you can do nothing. By the way, not a good plan, but hey, works for the ostrich. You can assess and recommend. Anyone involved in analytics and reporting, workforce planning, you should definitely be doing that. You should also be preparing and planning, meaning what do we currently report? What metrics do we use to run our business that involve people, talent, human capital? Probably some metrics going to the comp committee, obviously DE&I disclosure, diversity initiatives being disclosed, maybe things like engagement scores and other metrics depending on how important they are to your business. So every company has to make a determination of what is important or material. That's an important term or threshold for the SEC to running the business. And then if you really want to get it out there, lead the way by disclosing more. I know there are some organizations that are going to disclose some, and then they're going to signal that they're disclosing more. Others are just going to go, all in and go for, so to speak, the transparency points, the early adopter credibility by disclosing much more information. I would argue what it's going to become is an arms race, because if your company discloses 6 new metrics this year or this quarter, but your peers all disclose a dozen, then next quarter, you're going to be disclosing 15 or 18, and likewise. So everyone's going to be upping their game to disclose more. The critical item will be coming up with what are normative metrics by industry and perhaps even on a global scale. That's where that ISO standard comes in handy. So this is ultimately accelerated by the COVID crisis, because I think never before has HR been as central to data, reporting, well-being, safety and security of our workforce as before, and lots more that we could talk about with that. So what are my options in terms of, let's just answer the first question. Is this required? Can I ignore this? Not really, unless you're an ostrich, as I said before. The SEC states that human capital must be reported in detail by human capital area, subject to the company's determination that human capital, aka talent, is material to business performance and success. So that's a paraphrase, almost a direct quote, but a paraphrase of the SEC's actual statement. They didn't use the term talent. They use old school terms like personnel, which we don't want to use. What does that mean? Well, that means you have two options. You could take the high road. Human capital is material to our business performance, aka people are our most valuable asset. And that, based on what we're seeing in the marketplace, that's the decision most companies are making. Does that mean a company could make the determination that people, human capital, are not material to our business and business performance success? Yes, you could. However, the SEC, the outgoing SEC chairman, Jay Clayton, actually wrote a separate letter because he wanted to make sure he differentiated SEC's official statements from his own, that he had never interacted with any company for whom human capital or people were not material. So basically, he's never seen a valid exception to that determination. But each company has to make up their own mind. You can hopefully start to get an appreciation for, so to speak, the traps, the minefield that the SEC lays. In fact, a former attorney from the SEC actually told me in a sort of a tongue-in-cheek, joking way, said the SEC creates a cliff, then they turn on a fog machine all around the cliff so no one can see exactly where it is, and then they wait for companies to go way over the cliff, and of course they make an example of them by putting them in enforcement, giving them an enforcement action. And the idea is that keeps companies from getting too close to the cliff. So they take a conservative approach. And probably in this case, what that means is disclosing more, not less. So that's the low road. But if you do the low road, I would say be prepared for pushback at a minimum from institutional investors who are looking for more information. Particularly, the larger you are, the higher you up and are in the S&P 500, Fortune 500, Global 1000 list, the more of a target you are going to be. Also, don't be surprised if you become part of a shareholder class action lawsuit. We don't have a lot of time to get into it, but basically, if your CEO has made any statements about diversity and inclusion and equity, compensation, have they ever said our people are our most valuable asset, you can't unsay that. If they've ever disclosed in prior proxy statements or annual reports in the list of risks, ability to attract, retain, motivate, and build a well-being culture of talent, those are all statements that in effect say people are material to your business. So you can't unsay those if those have all been said. That's another reason why it's so difficult for companies to take the low road. You can't ignore everything your CEO or your organization has said or written in the past. So if you do take the high road, what does that mean? So, well, since they didn't disclose or specify metrics, the SEC left it open. They did suggest some areas around, talent acquisition, training, retention, engagement, cost, productivity, to decide what metrics to report. So that brings us to just a few more slides, and then we can turn this back for a discussion. Hopefully now all of you have just moved, by the way, if you weren't aware of any of this, you've just gone from level 1 to level 2. So congratulations. You were not aware of human capital reporting and some of the new standards before. You are now. Hopefully, you're like some organizations where you're already doing and reporting and disclosing more than what previous SEC requirements mandated. By the way, no companies, although I think we had one unit of Deutsche Bank is now fully ISO standard compliant. Most companies are not even ISO, the new ISO 30414. They're not fully compliant with that standard yet either, which we'll talk about in a moment. But just getting to full compliance, meaning you're preparing and reporting metrics, is not the end of the journey. The point of this slide is to show that there's really a maturity model here. Once you have the metrics, then you have to be able to provide answers to the questions for the CEO, the board, and management. So they've got a lot of human capital questions. How do we know we have the best talent? If we're, how is our workforce productivity improving or declining? And how are we measuring that? There's a lot of need and opportunity for answering those questions. And the most important part is once you have those metrics, you can't just hand the CEO or investor relations a page of metrics and say, here, let's report these and disclose these to the markets without a story. In finance, they've had to have an accounting, and I'm, as a former CFO, I know, it's not enough just to have metrics. You have to have a story about those metrics. Why are some metrics good and other metrics aren't as good? why are some improving and some are not improving at the same rate, or some are even declining? By the way, having metrics where you don't benchmark or look great is not necessarily a bad thing. It's all part of the story. You could say we have an above average attrition or turnover rate because we're a training ground and we we aggressively invest in and build our talent. And we know some of them are going to leave. That's why we invest so much in our talent. And by the way, that contributes to lower cost of workforce, higher productivity, engagement, and a great culture. So there's a positive story, spinning what normally is considered to be a really bad metric that you're losing people into a whole other game. And you can do that with almost any of the metrics. The idea is to tell them or integrate those metrics into a story that the board, the CEO, and ultimately the markets can hear and will buy into. And it may even give you a reward in terms of increased market value if your story is a good one. And many companies do have a good story. So I promised something on the ISO standard. Since the SEC didn't give us any specific metrics to report, I'll put sort of a pause on that because, by the way, with the administration change, there are bills in both houses of Congress that would mandate specific metrics to be required in terms of human capital disclosure and reporting in the U.S. So the era even of the SEC not mandating metrics could be over literally as soon as this year. Don't know, but likely in the next year or two, or relatively short term, we are going to have absolute mandated requirements. So what could you do? Well, one of the things I would encourage every company to do, besides looking at the metrics you already use in the business, is take a look at the ISO standard. Remember, I said this is sort of GAP. This is the how do you measure and report human capital. It's the closest thing. In fact, it is the only global standard in existence today. There's some other great reporting and goal setting that come out by the World Economic Forum, SASB, and others, but most of them are hard to measure. By the way, there's a lot of alignment with some of the metrics here in the ISO standard, but bar none, the ISO standard is the deepest, most detailed list of metrics that you can get anywhere. And it integrates with many of the others. Most of the others have far fewer, like SASB is very thin on exactly what metrics you should be reporting. It's more conceptual in many cases, although they're working on it with their human capital initiative. So here are the 11 areas that you would want to consider, and you can see the number of metrics are listed here in those 11 areas. So you can see it's a fairly holistic list, and it includes some things that you might not have thought of, perhaps disclosing before, around productivity, return on human capital, succession, obviously important, culture, organization culture, very important. And then some of the things that probably most of you already have and may be reporting, depending on what industry you're in: occupational health and safety, compliance and ethics, and of course diversity, which has probably been the fastest, most rapidly increasing area of greater disclosure. More than 50%, I believe, of the S&P 500 actually disclosed diversity metrics this last year before the SEC announcement. So easy to up your game there. In fact, a few companies have done some pretty in-depth diversity, equity, and inclusion reporting, even including pay parity. So this is a great place to start. And by the way, just to cover the standard, you don't have to disclose all 60 metrics to be in compliance with the ISO standard. For large companies, they're recommending 23. For small to medium-sized companies, only 10 metrics publicly disclosed. They're just saying, here are the 60 metrics that you should be measuring and reporting at a minimum internally. And then you can ultimately make a decision or signal when you are going to start disclosing those publicly. So that's really it. And here's some links if you want to get a copy of the ISO standard. It's not free, but it's very low cost. ISO is a nonprofit organization, so I think the cost is anywhere from $125 to $150 US. You can get information from a couple of other websites: the CFO Magazine article, humancapitalreporting.org. There's a new website out there called Human Capital Impact. And for any of you that are interested, I will probably put into the chat a group on LinkedIn called ISO 30414 Go to Market. So if you're interested in that, you want to kind of hear what's the latest, that's a group that's been sharing new articles around disclosure and reporting standards. So with that, why don't we pause, and Al, I'm happy to pick up the conversation with yourself.
Yeah. Well, Jeff, as always, thank you. I mean, you're doing work that many of us, frankly, don't want to do. So you're helping immensely on that front. The thing that I want to highlight, and we've touched on this before, if I am a people analytics practitioner, I might be going, oh, damn, that's more work. That's something else that might not be in my current CHRO's awareness. It might be something that I might see as a distraction from the cooler work that I could do. However, I believe, and I know you feel this as well, but I'd like you to talk to it. It also represents a great opportunity to elevate the visibility of not only our work, but the impact that we can have at senior levels, including the board. So can you speak to these reporting requirements as an opportunity as opposed to a burdensome, check the box?
Yep. And by the way, as a former CFO, when new disclosure rules came out, I was never happy about that because it just meant more work. So absolutely, it is more work. But you know what? You're probably already measuring and reporting a lot of this stuff already. And the best way to address something is to get in front of it. So what I would say, calculate all these metrics. Do every metric in the ISO standard. Make a whole separate decision. Are we going to disclose it? Yes or no. Are we comfortable with it? Yes or no. Do we have some normative data? Yes or no, but get the data, because what you don't want to have happen is the quarterly conference call or the annual shareholder meeting is taking place, or there's a letter that's come from institutional investors and somebody from investor relations runs down to HR, or actually they can't run down to HR because nobody's there anymore, but basically they reach out to you on Zoom or email and say, hey, can I get the ISO or our SEC compliant human capital reporting? We're being asked for it by shareholders and investors. And if you say, well, I haven't been able to get to that, that would probably not be a good career response. So this is an opportunity to bring this to the CHRO, to be that strategic player, to literally be in the room, virtually, of course, on the investor calls, because I think the CEOs are not going to be comfortable telling that full story until more information and there's kind of more maturity in these metrics. It's a tremendous opportunity for your CHRO and or yourself to literally be in the room and answer questions that investors might be asking, or to provide details around it. And so you get to basically interact with investors. Also, I'll say you're going to get a budget, because if you have to disclose and report this stuff in official annual reporting, shareholder proxy information, and you've been starved for budget, as most HR groups have, you can now say, well, I can't do good reporting if I don't have the right systems, tools, and staff. Also, by the way, you can now feel free, the whole Southwest thing, feel free to move about the country. Feel free to push your software vendors and providers to give you more compliant ISO reporting, which, by the way, is easier said than done, because the ISO standards are still being tweaked and formulated, kind of like other disclosure rules. They never stop changing.
Well, guys, there's so much I want to ask you on this, and we've had a deeper conversation on this topic. So as a follow-up with all the listeners and people who will see this as a recording afterwards, I'll make sure that there's a link to our deeper discussion on this topic and the resources that you shared. As we start to close, James Hoffman had a really good question that I think is worth fielding. Is that, okay, this is for publicly traded companies by and large. Is there any benefit from your perspective to use these guidelines in privately held or smaller organizations? What are your thoughts there?
Yes, and it's coming, right? Where does it usually start? Standards and rules and guidance. It starts with the public listed companies. What's going to happen is, if you're a large privately held company and you're going out to the market for debt or other kinds of placements or partnerships, what's going to happen is these metrics are going to find their way into due diligence. They're going to find their way into requirements from banking for lending. So you might as well do them. Again, the best defense is a good offense. Have all the metrics calculated. Get comfortable with them. I can tell you the best companies that have been disclosing this kind of information, most of them have been measuring it internally for a couple of years or a few years, and they've made improvements. So they start disclosing it. By the way, there's a study by Epic and Anthony Hesketh showing that companies that disclose more are higher performing. It's not that they get higher performing because they disclose more. It's because they've been doing the measurement, they've improved on the metrics, then they finally disclose it. It's the tip of the iceberg in terms of work. So once you're comfortable with the metric and you're disclosing it, you have the story and you have a good story. So I'd say start now, start working on that story, because it takes time to build it. Just getting a metric with a turnover rate or time to fill or any of the, or, basically, by the way, the ISO standard asks you to identify critical roles. Boy, how much learning have we gone through in the last year on what's a critical role, what's essential? A lot of companies would have thought they knew what essential workers were. And then when everyone had to leave the office, they figured out, oh, wow, we can't actually function as a company unless somebody goes in and opens the mail.
Great points. You're selling me. I mean, and I've been kind of watching this process, watching you dipped into it a little bit, and I'm like, all right, this is not my bailiwick. I gotta, but so to see it evolve to this point is actually fantastic. It's kind of, now we know what we're dealing with as opposed to this esoteric uncertainty around reporting requirements. So thanks for the work that you have done to influence this trajectory. And, now that we're at this stage, helping the community and organizations, understand what is the most appropriate response. So again, keep up the great work and look forward to following up in the near future. As we wrap, how can people learn more about you and HCMI?
Go to www.hcmi.co. And we've got a lot of information in terms of white papers, case studies, and quite a bit of information on the ISO standard and how to get what we call ISO compliant. That's another thing. If your company's risk averse, and which large companies aren't risk averse, you probably want to have some third-party sign-off on whatever you report. So if somebody says the metrics are wrong, you can go, well, Deloitte or PwC said it was okay, right? Yeah. Or one of the HR consulting firms. So I would encourage you to check into that, and that's a way that we can help organizations as well. Also coming up with what a metrics reporting strategy. What are you going to disclose now, and what are you going to signal that you're disclosing? So I know one of the largest Fortune 50 companies is not going to disclose a lot this time. They're going to signal that they're disclosing it so that they can get all their peers to disclose hopefully at the same time, and nobody kind of looks good or looks bad. Everyone's starting to report a new metric at about the same time. Right.
Well, again, super appreciate you and look forward to seeing you soon. I mean, if we're going to see anybody, I mean, you're just down there in Southern California, so hopefully it's not too long. So thanks again.
I can't wait till we can get together again in person. And thank you as always for the opportunity to speak and present on this topic, Al.
Of course. All right. Be well.